Hello and welcome to 100% Real with Ruby. Today I am joined by Tom with the most amazing accent to actually whip away some buffoonery, because it's always done better when someone has an accent from like Ireland or Scotland or Wales or the UK, just because it sounds a lot more wankery, which is just typical. So here's Tom, and we're actually, let's have you introduce yourself by talking about the absolute absurdity of shit that we see out there, starting with cold baths, actually, because that's got a lot of hype lately. Ice baths and cold exposure, because increases fat burning, or it increases your all the crap that they say. What do they say about ice baths? What's true, what's false, and what is a better way to actually get the gains that people think they're getting from ice baths?
Absolutely. So, hey, Ruby. So my accent's like, so I'm from the northeast of England. So I'm about an hour and a half away from the Scottish border. So I have I'm from Durham specifically. So this area was everyone worked in the mines. So they had their own accent called Pitmatic, and like a little bit of that's leached into my accent. But yeah, it's a mishmash. I don't have a proper Durham accent. Anyway, so yeah, ice
Called
bath.
the anti-wankery accent.
Yeah, the anti-wankery accent. Very nice. Wanker does sound good in my accent, I will say. All right, so yeah. So the ice baths thing, it's been around for ages. It's been repopularized primarily by Huberman, so far as I'm aware. But it's been something that people have spoken about for a really long time. And I only know that because I remember writing a blog about it in like 2010, telling people not to do ice baths. my position on this hasn't changed. So whenever people talk about ice baths and the benefits therein, there are kind of like three branches of stuff that people say. It's either that it helps your exercise recovery, it helps you burn fat, or there's just this kind of like nebulous health benefit, which probably breaks further down into like there's a big surge of hormones after an ice bath, or something to do with the immune system. And some of these things stand up to scrutiny a little bit more than others. Looking at fat burning first, because I think that's the one that people talk about the most, there's essentially two studies on this. So Huberman posted about both of these quite regularly. These are like the two most common citations. The first one was Solberg et al. From 2021, I think it was. But basically what Solberg and colleagues did was this. They took a bunch of people in, I want to say Norway, who swim regularly in iced water. Because that's the thing you do in really cold ass places. You go swimming in the ice. There's nothing better to do. So they took 8 people that take these regular ice swims. I think that's where this 11-minute per week recommendation that Huberman gives comes from. So he recommends you ice bath for 11 minutes a week. I want to say that's what they did on average. And they compared them to 7 control people. So this is a 15-person study, which is already a problem. But you take these people and you put them in a blanket, and the blanket can heat up and cool down. So you put them in a warm blanket for 45 minutes, then it goes really cold for 45 minutes, and then it's warm for 45 minutes, and then you measure a bunch of stuff. So what we're seeing here is the difference between people who are regularly exposed to cold and people who aren't regularly exposed to cold when they are then exposed to cold, if that makes sense. And like the headline result was that once you've been exposed to cold, it increases your metabolic rate a bit for the rest of the day. If you're not regularly exposed to cold, the increase you get is on average about 18 calories per hour, which is not huge, I think you'll agree, but it's also not nothing. Like if you math that out over 24 hours, it's like 400 and something calories, which is not horrendous. If you're regularly exposed to cold, though, it about doubles. So they got an increase of about 40 calories per hour. So what we're talking about here is if you are exposed to cold for 45 minutes, if you regularly do ice baths, you get an increase in your metabolic rate that's equivalent to walking really slowly for a while. Like, this is not nothing, but it's basically nothing. Like, this is not the groundbreaking result that people talk about. This is not going to make a significant difference. If you're just like active during the day, then you're going to get basically the same benefit. The other side of it,
and the lazy man's walking.
yeah, the other problem is, though, any increase in your metabolic rate is going to have other downstream effects. None of these things happen in isolation. And so if you're doing something that is going to increase your metabolic rate, that is almost certainly going to increase your appetite as well. Like, it's very, very difficult for that not to be the case. Because your body doesn't want to lose weight. We all know this. We've talked about this for ages. Whenever you're in a calorie deficit, your body does a bunch of adaptations to make you more hungry, to make you pay attention to food more, to make you move around a bit less. And there's no reason to assume that cold exposure wouldn't have those same effects. We've all seen the tendency that people have to eat a little bit more in the winter when it's cold. It's difficult to say that these things aren't going to be related. I don't have hard evidence of that, but that would be a major suspicion that I had. This study also had other problems. So like the people who do the regular cold swimming I think they had like 50% less body fat than the people who didn't do the regular swimming. So the controlling was a bit weird. But anyway, so that's one of the studies, and you can already tell it's a bit shit and the results weren't that impressive. The other study that people talk about is a recent military study, which was just terrible to begin with. So they took these military personnel and they gave some of them ice baths for a certain amount of time every day, and they gave some of them nothing. But they didn't then compare these two groups. You got the people who got ice baths, they did the process and they compared their body fat before and after the ice bath process, but they didn't then compare that to the control group, which is a really weird way to do a study. That's the purpose of a control group. Usually when you do research, you do an experiment and you compare the outcomes of that experiment to if you hadn't done the intervention. So if I wanted to test a supplement and see if it makes you stronger, what I would do is I would get a bunch of people, I'd give half of them supplement, wouldn't give the other half anything. Then I'd match them for the training process that they went through over a given period of time. And then I would compare how much strength both group gained. And it's like, right, okay, if the supplement group gained more strength, the supplement might have helped. That's generally how you do a controlled experiment, right? This is the equivalent of, I take two groups of people, both of them do the same strength program. I give half of them the supplement, and then say, oh, the supplement people got stronger over time. I'm not going to compare them to the other people, but they got stronger over time, therefore the supplement works. Like, it's just a really silly way of doing things. And all of the evidence for fat loss in humans based on cold exposure hinges on these two experiments. It's just, the evidence just isn't there.
Here's a funny thing. Two stupid studies, like, they're honestly really ridiculous if you think about it in the real context of things, because it's not done in the real world environment. But if you actually take the numbers that Tom just said, and you think about the last two podcasts that I released with Gab Fundero, something that has a greater magnitude is your choice of food intake. It like about triple what Tom said. If you choose less processed food, if you choose more whole foods, more veggies, and then if you want to even double that, if you eat more protein in your diet, there's a higher thermic effect of food. The thermic effect of food has a greater difference than sitting yourself in an ice cold bath and hating life for the 11 minutes that you need to sit in some disgustingly cold water for. Now, I never really heard of the fat burning difference until recently. Where I see people come up with it is, oh, it's the best way to start your day because it's going to boost your cortisol, or it's going to make you more resilient to stress. Freaking stub your toe or accidentally burn yourself on a pan and you can do the same thing. Like, just do a hard exercise session in the morning and you can regulate your cortisol that way. But there are certain cases, like I have one girl at the moment who needs to actually get a little bit of that buzz in the morning because she doesn't have it, that is doing a cold shower for 30 seconds, but it is not for stress resilience. It is literally just something that I would only recommend to her. So maybe you can elaborate on that bit a little bit longer before we kind of merge that into the same argument around freedom coffee.
Oh, 100%. So these are the other two main benefits that people talk about. Is like the nebulous health thing, and then there's the exercise recovery, which we'll come to right at the end. So the nebulous health thing, it usually hinges around these hormone boosts. So it's like, oh, if you jump in cold water, then it increases cold shock proteins, or it increases cortisol resilience, or it increases dopamine. And exactly as you just said, that's because it creates a stress response. Like, creating small amounts of stress response is important. It's a good thing. I think the term's hormesis, which is where you like expose yourself to small amounts of stress and you become more resilient to that stress. But exactly as you said, that's what exercise does. That's what exercise is for. And I'm and this point here kind of goes broadly around a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today. I'm extremely hesitant to just accept on face value that these effects stack. So I don't know if you've ever played like a Dungeons and Dragons type thing, right? But one of the things you get in D&D based stuff is that effects don't stack. So if you wear a certain armor and you get like an effect from that, like, oh, it boosts your resilience to whatever. If you get a ring that also boosts resilience to whatever, you're not allowed to stack those two. You have to pick one of the two. And I I don't know that it is the case that a person who exercises regularly and gets the hormesis effect from that and gets the dopamine and adrenaline and all of that from that, if you exercise in the morning, I don't know that if you take an ice bath, you get an additional benefit. And I would imagine you probably don't. So it kind of feels like it doesn't have to be one or the other. I just don't know that if you're already a healthy person who's exercising regularly, if the hormone boosts that you get from these ice baths are actually going to do anything.
Also, if you think about it, any time that we put a stress on our body, the goal is usually to get a certain adaptation. And training, you're chasing adaptations that you want, like building muscle, building strength, building your capacity to train harder, to do more. What the fuck are you trying to build getting into an ice bath? The ability to stay in there for another 30 minutes and waste 30 minutes of your life instead of 2 seconds? Like, what adaptate? Like, it's...
Well, yeah, I mean, that's basically what they found in that first study that I said about the Danish or Norwegian or whatever ice swimmers. They were just well adapted to being cold. Now, unless you're going to be cold in real life, it's kind of like training for something that you're just... I don't know. It's like training to be better at putting your hand on a hot stove. Like, right, cool, but you could just not do that and you'd be fine. I mean, and then we can link that into... So, yeah, fat loss benefits, basically non-existent. Health benefits probably do exist to an extent, but all of the health benefits that you're getting from ice baths comes from the fact that it's exposure to stress, and you're already exposing yourself to stress if you're exercising regularly. And I don't know if you get additional benefit.
I want to add the health benefits that people purport to get from cold exposure. I would say you get even more from putting yourself into a sauna, because you get a lot of cardiovascular benefits from the heat exposure. And at the same time, you're promoting more recovery in a well-adaptive way. Exactly, this has been going on for ages. Now that you say that, I remember back in ages ago, I was studying the fact that ice baths actually attenuate muscle synthesis. Like, you will not get the gains you think you're going to get. And even explosive power, if you're training for explosive power in explosive sports, power development and muscle development are blunted once you expose that to cold. But when you expose it to heat, you're actually helping the process of healing in a way that you're going to still get those adaptations, plus the health benefits.
Yeah, I haven't looked into the heat exposure thing. So that is a big I don't know. And I'll not comment further on that because I literally don't know.
That was the thing I actually experimented on for myself. So I do want to add that it did actually lower my blood pressure quite a bit over doing it consistently twice a week for a good... I only actually looked at my results a month apart. So I would say it is really good for blood pressure. And you can start to tolerate it a lot more, which actually made me less heated while I was training. So I was able to train harder. Whereas usually I get really hot and bothered during my session and I can't push as hard. But doing that exposure allowed me to adapt to that heat that I get through my training. So I'll let you take over, but I just wanted to add that in.
No, that's really cool. So what kind of protocol did you use? Because as I say, I've not looked into this at all.
So I did 2 times 35 minutes, and it was 60 to 70 degrees Celsius in the sauna. So I did that twice a week. There was 1 week where I did it 3 times a week. And that over that whole 4 weeks, my blood pressure dropped from, I don't know how it got so high, but it dropped from 136 over 79 or something to then 112, I think. So it was really good, and my heart rate went back to the lowness that it used to be, because my resting heart rate's usually around 40, but it was sitting around 50 for quite a while before then. So then I went back to my usual. So it was I didn't actually think it would do anything until I experimented it for myself, and then I looked into it more, and now I'm like, yeah, this is really good for heart health.
That's really cool. I like that a lot. And I've got to say, I can imagine that being in a sauna is more pleasant than an ice bath. Though I will say, and ice bath people, don't get too annoyed. If you enjoy an ice bath, like, fine. I don't care. I'm not saying don't do them necessarily, though I might say not to do them in a second. I'm just saying if you're not doing them, like, you're not missing out on anything. I like going from a sauna into an ice plunge at a spa as much as everybody else does. that's a normal part of the human experience, but I wouldn't sit in a ice-filled wheelie bin in my garden, is all I'm saying. But I mean, in terms of the exercise thing, exactly as you've said, we've had evidence for a really long time that cold exposure, like extreme cold exposure, like ice baths, it improves your recovery from training. But the way it does that is by blunting the inflammatory response that is necessary for adaptation from training. So that means that it does have you some utility. Let's say you're competing in a sport where you're going to have 3 competitions in a week, or I don't know, maybe you play football or soccer for non-UK people, and it's coming towards the end of the season, and you've got a bunch of cup games, and you need to play 4 times across 2 weeks. At that point, the adaptations from training aren't really important. You just need to be able to perform and then be ready to perform again. And so, in that kind of instance, there's probably utility for ice baths. So, like, for athletes, if you're competing at the Olympics and you've got to do a bunch of competitions over a bunch of days, again, you're not looking for adaptations. You've already got them. You're adapted. You just want to be able to recover and do it again. But if you're looking to recover from a training session that was designed to create an adaptation, the stuff that ice baths block is really important for getting that adaptation. And so it's completely self-defeating. To my understanding, the effects are less for strength accrual, because you develop strength in a slightly different way than you develop additional muscle mass. It's kind of 2 different related, but not exactly the same mechanisms. But yeah, if you're looking to build muscle and you're sore, so you get in an ice bath, it's a bad move. And so if you're overall looking for hypertrophy, I probably wouldn't ice bath very often.
Yeah, see, if you really hate cold exposure, something that I only at the moment only have 2 athletes that I coach, and when they're in their close to competing or actually event races, I just load them up on tart cherry and beetroot juice and friggin' vitamin C, which we know is not really good for actually getting adaptations, because it's an antioxidant, so it can blunt it the same way that an ice bath does without the discomfort.
To my understanding, the mechanism that vitamin C and antioxidants and stuff like that, especially dietary ones, affect inflammation is different. So if you take like an ice bath or an anti-inflammatory medication, they blunt the immune response. They prevent it happening. Whereas if you take a high antioxidant load diet, and the mechanism for this isn't that well known. It could be to do with reduced concentration, or it could be to do with the food matrix or something. But what you see is that inflammation dies off quicker, but it seems like the body's basically regulating it better, as opposed to it being blunted with like a blunt force object. As far as I know, high antioxidant supplements do blunt it, but just a high antioxidant diet doesn't. So again, it's probably something to do with concentration. You can get a lot more antioxidants in a supplement than you can get in like some oranges. But yeah, so a high antioxidant diet is not a bad thing. An anti-inflammatory rich diet, which again is just a Mediterranean style diet, really, you don't have to pick any special foods. That is a good idea. But anything that actively blocks that inflammation is probably not the move if you're looking to adapt. Though, as we've said, if you're looking for competition, you're not looking to adapt. You just need to get your shit together so you can do it again.
again, specific protocols for every single case, which is why the best advice can be the worst advice for you in the wrong circumstance. Now with this stupid, we have ranted on about this so many times, and the amount of times that I put it onto my Facebook to only get people butthurt because Huberman says, drink water before you drink coffee. Wait an hour or 2 or 3 before you drink coffee. Just don't have coffee in the morning. Eat food. Can we please put this bullshit to rest?
Right. So I would put this advice in the same category as don't eat carbs after 8 p.m. Right? It is an entirely arbitrary thing that you don't have to do, but people who do it will probably get better outcomes because of other reasons. So if you don't eat carbs after 8 p.m., you'll probably lose fat. And the reason for that is because the carbs that you eat after 8 p.m. are usually in the form of like crisps or chips and ice cream and pizza and all of these lovely things that put you in a calorie surplus. And if you just have a hard rule where you don't eat carbs after 8 o'clock, what that can do is it can take away a lot of the decisions that people make, and it can correlate with better food choices. Like I have clients now who don't eat after 7 p.m. Not because that's a magic cutoff and calories after that are stored differently, but because the food they eat after 7 p.m. is shit. It puts them in a calorie surplus. And for that specific person, that self-imposed rule, they decided, right, I'm just not going to eat after 7 p.m. That has helped them to regulate their calorie intake. So the Huberman coffee in the morning thing. He suggests a couple of reasons for this. One of them is to do with the mechanism of action that one of the mechanism of actions that caffeine has, which, to my understanding, is just like he's kind of got some theories and then just ran with it, which is a broad thing that the biohacky people tend to do. You take some mechanisms and then you assume an outcome based on those mechanisms. So one of the ways that caffeine works is it blocks adenosine receptors. So we've all heard of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. It's the energy currency of the body. Whenever your body wants to do anything, it uses this thing called ATP, which is an adenosine with a chain of 3 things attached to it. You break off one of those things, that releases energy, that allows your body to do something, whether that is contract a muscle or make a protein or move an enzyme somewhere. ATP is involved in that. And then when you eat food, especially glucose and fatty acids, what your body does with that through the energy systems is makes ATP again. Nutrition serves to recycle ATP, if you look at it from a really oversimplified manner. So during the day, your brain is doing a bunch of stuff, and that stuff breaks up these ATP, and eventually you end up with a bunch of free adenosine. That free adenosine is therefore a marker of brain activity. As your brain does more stuff, it produces more adenosine. Adenosine can then bind to adenosine receptors in the brain, and this creates something called sleep pressure. So one of the ways that sleep is regulated is during the day, brain activity is quite high, and so you produce adenosine quite quickly, faster than your brain can clear it out. And so during the day, adenosine builds up and up and up and up and up, binds onto adenosine receptors more and more. This creates sleep pressure, makes you want to go to sleep. Then during the night, brain activity is still going on, but it's reduced in comparison to during the day. And that means that the adenosine production rate falls below the adenosine clearance rate. You clear out adenosine during the night, and that's why you wake up refreshed in the morning. So that's one of the 2 ways that your body regulates sleep. The other way is circadian rhythm. So caffeine works to block adenosine receptors. It can basically mask tiredness by preventing the thing that creates sleep pressure from creating that sleep pressure. The problem is, once the caffeine is metabolized, the adenosine receptors are free again, and that adenosine hasn't gone anywhere. So the adenosine is all just going to flood the receptors, and you feel really tired, and that's what like a caffeine crash is. So all delaying your coffee intake will do is it will mean that you block adenosine receptors later, and you get a caffeine crash later. That's functionally all it'll do. And so one of the things that Huberman says is when you wake up in the morning, you get a big release of cortisol. Cortisol wakes you up. It's important. That's what it's supposed to do. And if you have caffeine, that creates a bit of a stress response. So that affects the cortisol release. And then also you get an early caffeine crash. And so if you delay your coffee, you allow your body's natural cortisol levels to work, and then you block adenosine receptors later, meaning that it works a bit better. And that is just shit he made up. Like he just made that up. To my understanding, there's no evidence that caffeine significantly disrupts that cortisol release in the body to the point that it makes a difference. And that's always the question that we need to ask. We don't need to ask, does it disrupt the cortisol release? We need to ask, okay, it disrupts the cortisol release, so what? And that question, to my understanding, hasn't been answered. But one thing that delaying your coffee by 90 minutes can do is it can make you feel like an absolute bag of shit in the morning. So you can realize, oh, I probably need to sleep more. And so in kind of a roundabout way, what delaying your coffee in the morning can do is it can prevent you from blocking the tiredness that you would have felt if you had available adenosine receptors in the morning. So if you're waking up and you've still got this buildup of adenosine because you've underslept, what caffeine can do is it can prevent you from realizing that. And then that being underslept can have negative effects on your health and well-being that caffeine facilitates. So if you delay your coffee, what that can make you do is think, oh God, I felt so tired this morning, when you actually might not have realized had you had coffee when you first wake up. So you might sort it out. You might improve your sleep hygiene. That improved sleep hygiene means you wake up feeling more energized in the morning anyway, because you actually feel rested. Then you can delay your coffee. And so downstream, delaying your coffee might have good effects. Or you can just fix your sleep and have coffee in the morning like everybody else. It's might incidentally make behavioral improvements, but doesn't actually mechanistically do anything. It's one of those things.
I hate that I really want to rant on about regarding, because honestly, when it comes to this subject, it really pisses me the hell off, because number one, hydrate before you caffeinate. Bro, coffee is hydrating. It is coffee in itself. Like, if you want to dehydrate yourself, have a caffeine pill. Coffee has water. It is hydrating. Oh, but I pee a lot. Well, no shit. You just drink more water. And all that does is just makes you want to urinate more. But you are literally more hydrated after drinking coffee than you are before you drink the coffee. So you don't need to hydrate before you caffeinate. That's my first rant. The second rant is the whole breakfast, coffee is not breakfast thing. It's like, yeah, so what? You can still have coffee before, because I have coffee pretty much as my first thing of the day, and then I eat a couple of hours later, which is my pre-workout before I train. The reason why coffee instead of food is such a bad idea for some people is because they leave the house as a busy mom, they have their coffee, now they're having some weird sugar crash, sugar craving, because they inherently eat unhealthy as it is. So then they grab some granola bar, maybe some pastries. They don't have time to eat lunch, so then they grab another coffee, and by the end of the day they're gorging the pantry out. And then there are the stressed moms. They have something quick in the morning with some coffee, and then they have something else through the day, if they even have that, or they try to push out lunch, and then all of a sudden they're in Macca's drive-through, or McDonald's for the non-Aussies that like to slang everything, and having crap over there. Like, busy moms, yeah, it would make sense. You need to eat before that first meal. And I would say the first meal is the most important meal of the day for the majority of people. That, obviously for us, it doesn't really all that matter, but most people cannot eat enough protein in the day. A lot of people do not get enough fruit and veggies in the day. The first meal of the day is the best time to set that up. A lot of the time, people do not understand the way that movement and energy is created and made, whatever. If you just hoard your food for the end of the day, your main activity is during the day. That is when you're going to be burning the most energy. A lot of people have I had a post that I put up ages ago about having your calorie deficit on paper is not always, a lot of the time, not a calorie deficit at the cellular level, because of these mechanisms that happen that make that calorie deficit number never a deficit, especially if you're highly stressed as well. Because if you're highly stressed, your body's not going to be effectively using its energy and down-regulating how much energy actually comes out of the body, despite the fact that you're getting the energy in. So now your calorie deficit that was here is now here. And then if you eat a lot of packaged foods, that calorie deficit is not a calorie deficit anymore because now you're eating all these packaged foods. Like there are so many different things that can throw it out. It's got nothing to do with the coffee. That just became its own rant in itself, because I guess it kind of, you can touch on that if you want to touch on that too, but it leads into the next question, which is women going on to like keto, low carb, whatever. They're already really stressed out because they hate their friggin' lives. They hate their bodies. They want to change this. They want to change that. They just have stress in general. Why are carbs super beneficial for highly stressed individuals and women in particular, because thyroid? So two different things there.
So I couldn't agree more with what you were saying about the coffee and breakfast thing. So I've said this to people before. Like, I think the rise of intermittent fasting has been one of the most like negative things for the understanding that people have of how nutrition works. In that, yes, intermittent fasting is possible. Yes, if you skip breakfast and yet account for the calories and the protein and everything, it can work just fine. And intermittent fasting can be a useful way to control your calorie intake and et cetera, et cetera. But it feels as though people were so desperate to promote this idea that breakfast isn't the most important meal of the day, and look how clever I am, look how right I am, that they forgot how behavior works. And in my experience of working with clients, exactly as you said, if my clients aren't eating breakfast, they find it way harder to hit their protein goal. I'm not saying they can't do it, but it's harder. They find it way harder to eat an adequate amount of fiber. They find it way harder to eat 5 to 6 portions of fruits and vegetables per day. Again, it's not to say you can't do it, but it's so much more difficult. And when you factor in the fact that most people struggle to eat well anyway, reducing their opportunities to eat healthily by like a third, it doesn't make it that much easier. And as you say, having coffee as breakfast kind of facilitates that, because it's a warm thing that goes into your stomach, so you feel a little bit of satisfaction, you feel a little bit full. Caffeine can act as an appetite suppressant to an extent. And so it can facilitate the skipping of breakfast, which then just precedes this day of not eating as much as you should do. Now, when it comes to the importance of carbs, the way that I tend to talk about this is not necessarily carb specific. So there are some potential mechanisms wherein a low carb diet can negatively affect women, especially. So it could potentially affect thyroid function, maybe. There's also the link between a moderate consuming carbohydrates, which increases tryptophan in the brain. Tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin. So there's this idea that if you eat lots of carbohydrates, then it increases serotonin. That's not really how that works. For two reasons. One of them, if you eat protein alongside the carbohydrates, that just kind of doesn't happen anymore, which most people aren't eating carbohydrate-only meals, hopefully. Like that probably wouldn't be a good thing. And the other thing is, just because tryptophan is used to make serotonin, that doesn't mean that if you add a bunch of tryptophan that you necessarily get more serotonin. That's not necessarily how that works. Like putting more bricks on a building site doesn't make more houses until you've got builders to build them. But if you look at research on low carb and ketogenic diets, there are two broad patterns that you see. There are three broad patterns that you see. One of them, adherence rates are kind of difficult. Carbohydrates are a staple food. Well, all staple foods are carbohydrates, pretty much. If you think of staple foods, you're thinking of rice, beans, bread, pasta, like potatoes. Staple foods are carbohydrates. And so the diet that we eat is carbohydrate based. And so avoiding that is just kind of difficult. It sucks. People don't enjoy it. So adherence rates are a bit Now, the other two patterns that you see are if protein and calories are matched between a low carb approach and a high carb approach, the outcomes that you get in terms of body composition are effectively the same. So the most famous example of this that people talk about is there's a wonderful researcher called Kevin Hall. He came from physics rather than nutrition background. So he has a different way of looking at nutrition research.
Yeah. I spoke about this one with Alan Aragon actually, and it was in a metabolic. Yeah. It was in a metabolic ward, wasn't it? So yeah, so what I discussed with Alan Aragon was, but so what? How does this apply in the real life? Because in reality, the higher carb diet would actually come out on top for body composition, because what does that lead to? Better training performance, better strength, better energy through the day. You'll be able to use those carbs more. Whereas if you're on, like, I will be talking, we can bring it up now as well. There are, like, it's the right advice for the right people, because there are some people that are more insulin resistant, or ones that aren't as insulin sensitive, that won't use the carbs as well. But that isn't all about the carbs, because we don't eat carbs, we eat food. And there's, okay, you can eat gummy bears, or you can eat fruit, or you can eat potatoes. Like, there are different carbs on the spectrum, and they all impact you differently. And then if you have carbs with protein, something protein does, like the opposite of insulin is glucagon. Something that protein does is that it stimulates the glucagon in the end turn, so that it can recirculate that whole glucose system, so that it lasts in the system longer. So pretty much what I'm trying to say in dumb terms is that if you're having carbs with protein, yes, you're going to still get the insulin release, because protein spikes insulin, but it's going to be more sustained. The best way for you to fix your shit is to get more, well, I would say actually getting aerobically conditioned and moving your body more, building more muscle, because the carbs can serve you if you use it in the right way. But I just really wanted to say that as well, because it's like the carbs can serve a purpose in the real world if you zoom out and ask yourself, okay, so what is it that I want to get the end outcome? I need to improve my training performance. I need to improve my energy through the day. I'm a busy, stressed out mum who's running on freaking blood glucose all the time because my cortisol's through the roof. So how can I actually help this? Okay, let's actually feed it the carbs, so then I can have the energy, so that I stop getting energy crashes and then eating a whole friggin' crisps packet.
It would be a crisp packet, just to. No, so
Chips.
So I love that, and this is kind of what I'm laboriously trying to get towards. So what you see in that metabolic ward study is, if you've got a diet that's 50% sugar versus a diet that's 5% carbs, fat loss is the same when protein and calories are matched. Wonderful. Okay, that tells us that there's no mechanistic reason to go low carb if you want to lose fat. Delightful. That's a nice thing to know. But what you also see is, if you compare a low carb diet to a low fat diet and you don't match carbs and don't match calories and protein, the low carb diet people lose more weight. And the reason for that is because if you cut out an entire macronutrient, you reduce your calorie intake significantly. And what the problem is with that is, if you're doing that chronically and you've got a menstrual cycle, this can lead you to some really big problems. So a term that all people in this space should be relatively familiar with is hypothalamic amenorrhea. This is where you lose your menstrual cycle, or you experience menstrual cycle disruption because of essentially an excessively low calorie intake or an excessively high exercise load, or both, usually both. And so if you're eating a low carb diet, there's no mechanistic reason to do that, as per metabolic ward study. It predisposes you to radical underconsumption and insufficient training fuel, as Ruby just mentioned, because if you're looking to do intense exercise, which I would define as training kind of close to failure, regardless of rep range, which is kind of close to failure, or training with a heart rate of above like 75%, that will be fueled by carbohydrate. It just will, because you need to use fast twitch muscle fibers to do that. So these are your fast twitch type 2A type 2B muscle fibers. And they can't use fat very efficiently. So if you're on a low carb diet, you can't train as hard, you're predisposed to underconsumption, and it's unnecessary. It just doesn't work. And this is where I wanted to loop that into what we were talking about intermittent fasting and the coffee for breakfast thing, because what you raised there was actually really, really important. If it fits your macros movement of like the early 2010s, where people were like, oh, as long as you hit your protein, carbs, fats, fiber throughout the day, it doesn't matter what you eat, it doesn't matter when you eat. That movement made a really big mistake, in that it's kind of shifted everyone's perception of nutrition into this thing that exists in 24-hour cycles. And it doesn't. We all know this. When we're talking about fat loss, You can eat a bit more some days and a bit less some other days, and this leads to the same fat loss as long as it all evens out. And we all know that, but we don't think of it in terms of the other way around. So we all think about, you can think of calorie balance over 7 days, you can think of calorie balance over a month. Wonderful. But let's look at calorie balance over the course of 24 hours. If you're really under eating during the day and then you make up your calories on the night, that can predispose you to overeating. Wonderful. But the other problem that you run into is that means that something called energy availability, which we can get into if you want, and talk about what energy availability.
Yeah, I love this conversation. This is what I love.
Cool. So we'll park that. We'll define energy availability in a minute. But if you undereat during the day and match your calories at the night, even if your calorie balance then ends up being theoretically adequate, because you've spent so much of your day in a state of low energy availability, evidence suggests this can lead to disruptions in menstrual cycle. So you can end up with these hormonal issues even if you're technically eating enough, because you're not eating enough throughout a bunch of the day. This is especially influential for people who train in the morning. So if you get a coffee, go train, come away, have a little snack, have a small lunch, and then have a big evening meal, this can predispose you to problems. I'm not saying that's going to affect everybody, obviously, but it's not an eating pattern that I would recommend. And eating low carb will lead you towards being more likely to experience that.
Because you're talking about the daytime, I want to emphasize this is exactly what I mean when I say that your metabolism is running on a 1,200 calorie engine. If you are feeding your body that little throughout the week and then overeating or over drinking on weekends, you are just going to be adding extra fat because your body is not in a state to actually use that effectively. It is going to be storing that mostly as fat. You are anabolic to fat gain because your fat burning processes, your muscle synthesis processes are all diminished because of the highest stress state. Your body's in a higher state of stress. Things aren't working effectively. And like Tom's about to allude to, low energy availability.
So energy availability, I think, it's not something that I usually talk about with people who aren't athletes. Because it's kind of, as I was just hinting at, it's this combination of high energy output and low energy intake is primarily where it comes from. But that's not to say that low energy intake on its own can't cause the problem. So here's how to think of energy availability. Your body needs a certain amount of energy day to day to just exist. So what we're talking about there is like regular cellular turnover, the production of hormones, the repair of protein that exists anyway, making your liver work, letting your kidneys do their thing. Like your body just needs energy to do all of that. And we talk about that as your basal metabolic rate. And there are a bunch of calculations you can do online to like estimate it.
I just want to quickly add in one type of person, because you mentioned the athletes thing. One thing that I know, Luke Lehman, my mentor, something he says as well is you're technically not in an energy deficit pretty much ever if you have a lot of stored body fat, because the body can use that. So if you do have a lot of stored body fat, you're less likely to be in a low energy state. But the thing is, it's still like you are still in a high stress state. So the same thing still applies. You're not going to be using those calories effectively, because what do you do on the weekends? You don't do anything as effectively as during the week when you're actually in a prime place to use the energy. But a lot more traditional people are finding themselves in this state because they're trying to stay lean, or they're trying to, like, they're the skinny fat type of people where that can still apply.
100%. And I'll actually get to that at the end of this meandering monologue, because there's a good example that I think is important that was actually really surprising to me when I read about it. So you've got your basal metabolic rate. Your body needs enough energy to do whatever it needs to do during the day. Wonderful. You then need additional energy to move about, to do your job, to do what I'm doing now, where like I'm sat with reasonable posture and I'm waving my arms all over the place. I'm not exercising, but I'm expending energy. That's non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT, or spontaneous physical activity, or SPA, depending what you read. And then you've got the energy that you expend during exercise. Now, what can happen is, and what we need to remember is, if you're going to do exercise, that has to take up energy. There's no way around that. To do let's say you're going to run a mile, It's going to burn somewhere around 100 calories-ish for most people. Now, just because you're under eating, even if you ate nothing, your body would still need to expend that energy to run that mile. It's non-optional, it's non-negotiable. If you do exercise, that energy is being expended. And that means that whatever exercise you do will necessarily take away energy from all of those other things that your body wants to do. And while it might be the case that for survival, it would make more sense to take away energy from exercise and donate it to making your liver work, your body can't do that because you're forcing it to exercise. And so what energy availability as a concept expresses is this idea whereby if you're under eating and doing a lot of exercise, even if you're not losing weight because you're eating enough to maintain your weight, or if you're not losing weight extremely quickly, or you're not starving to death because you've got adequate body fat, it's still possible that you could be sequestering all of the energy that your body wants to use for regular day-to-day function and putting it towards exercise. And there are calculations you can do to estimate energy availability. What you do is you work out your lean body mass. So you take your body weight and you subtract your body fat percentage. That's your lean body mass. Then you take the number of calories that you eat on an average day. You subtract from that the number of calories that you expend on exercise on an average day. And then you divide that calorie amount by your lean body mass, and that gives you an amount of energy availability per kilogram of lean body mass. And
that would be really hard for a lot of general people to try to grasp, because body fat percentages are far from accurate, and so are your exercise calories.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to quantify, but that's kind of how it's quantified. And it's usually recommended, and most of this research is done in women, granted, so men might be able to get away with a bit less because we don't have a menstrual cycle to worry about.
It's 5 energy availability points less, so we need to be around 40 and they need to be around 35.
45.
40, that's the one, 45.
Yeah, so if you fall below that, that runs into problems. But what some research is finding is that you can also look at that on a day-to-day basis. So even if you're at that 45 calories per kilo energy availability, if you're stacking that all towards the end of the day and not eating around your exercise, you're spending a lot of your day in an energy availability deficit. And that can lead to issues with the menstrual cycle, issues with hormone production. And so this is kind of a long-rooted way of saying intermittent fasting is probably not very good if you exercise a lot. Bear in mind, the person who first popularized intermittent fasting, Martin Birkin from Sweden back in like 2005, he advocated for extremely low volume training, like 3 times a week. Like, he was not doing this like hybrid training, powerlifting and marathon running and intermittent fasting all at the same time, because that's a really good way to just break yourself. Just because exposure to stress is good, that doesn't mean that the more stress you can expose yourself to, the better it's going to be. It's not how that works. But the example I wanted to give, just to close this one off, because you said something about if you've got elevated levels of body fat, you can kind of get away with it. To an extent, that's true. But a clinical case study was published a couple of years ago now about a collegiate level swimmer. So in his off season, he was trying to lose body fat because he was a bit overweight for the swim team. And he presented to a clinic with like completely lost libido, reduced sexual function, etc. And it was found that in the title of the paper, they describe it as extremely low testosterone. So both his free testosterone and his total testosterone were like the level of like an 80-year-old woman. And it was because he was eating something like 2,000 calories and expending something like 4,000 calories a day, just because he was a big dude and he was swimming a lot. But he was something like 17-18% body fat. So he wasn't extremely lean. Like, that is athletic. Like, no one would ever look at a person of like 17-18% body fat as a dude and think they're out of shape. But we're not talking about people who are shredded. We're not talking about people who are getting extremely lean. This is a problem that can present even if you're at a healthy body weight. So don't think you're immune to it.
I was thinking more around 30 to 40% body fat when I said that. But something I would also say you need to recognize is that all this shit is systemic stress on the body. Dieting, calorie deficits, nutrient deficits are all stresses on the body. And if you listen to my podcast with Luke Lehman, The third one where we spoke about micronutrients. The body needs those micronutrients to buffer processes in the body and to be able to create enzymes to be able to keep the metabolic processes going in themselves. If you're putting all of this stress load on the body, because yeah, you can diet really freaking hard, especially if you have a lot of body fat to lose. You can do extreme freaking diets, but you can't go adding in a shitload of marathon running and CrossFit workouts and all this bullshit on top of that, because you're going to create a catastrophe. So if you're going to do those extreme diets, they need to be under supervision with a nutritionist or with someone who knows what they're doing, because the type of exercise you're doing needs to be something that complements your nutrition. Nutrition needs to complement your exercise. Otherwise, you're just digging a really freaking deep hole.
Yeah, and that I think is the important thing. A lot of the ice baths and fasting and all of that, people talk about these things as beneficial because of the, essentially, as we spoke about, because of the stress response. If you're exposed to a stress response, you get an increase in noradrenaline and cortisol, you get an increase in dopamine, you get improved immunity. All of these things happens as a part of the stress response. And if you never are exposed to stress, therefore, you would benefit from being exposed to stress. But there is a point at which stress no longer becomes adaptive. The whole point of hormesis is to be exposed to a small amount of something and develop an immunity to it. People used to do this with poison. If you take a tiny amount of arsenic, over time, you can get better at handling arsenic. And so
you just friggin' drink a whole bottle of scotch.
Yeah, I'll just do that.
Poison yourself.
But if you have too much, it's a bad thing, and that's such a non-point. That's such a boring, obvious thing to say, but it's the thing that people forget about when they're looking at these morning routines that have like 85 different things. But to your point on there, you can diet really hard as long as you're doing it sensibly and without exercise and so on. I always bring up the have you heard of Angus Barbieri?
No.
You might have heard of what he did. So Angus Barbieri was a man in Scotland. He went to his doctor in the 60s and went, I'm sick of being fat, so I'm just not going to eat anymore. So he was like, he had morbid obesity, and he didn't eat under medical supervision for like 380 days, lost like 60% of his body weight, and then went back to eating and gained like 6% back and just was lean now. So that kind of illustrates what the human body can do, and it is possible, and he experienced like no negative from it. He just kind of drank tea and coffee for over a year, and that was it. And then he didn't have morbid obesity anymore. But if he was exercising at the same time, he probably would have experienced a lot of really bad things. So yeah, and the big issue that I have with a lot of I'd refer to it as just like biohacky stuff, which is ice baths, it's specific breath work, it's intermittent fasting, it's delaying your coffee intake, it's doing all of these things. Is that, like, going back to the D&D thing, it's the assumption that all of these things are stackable. It's the assumption that something is good, so more of that thing is better. And this is a very American way of looking at things, and I don't think it's any coincidence that a lot of the people who talk about these things come from the US. And there are other reasons for that we can get into if you want, depending on how far like into the political ideological side of things you want to get.
I know nothing about the American politics.
It's not American politics per se, it's the American mindset towards these kind of things, which it leeches from the way that they do things. But
I would just say it's social media bullshit, because to the point you're gonna say as well, how long is it before your ideal of optimizing your morning is not going to become this 2-hour ordeal that just adds more stress to your friggin' plate?
Yeah, like, oh, look at my morning routine. And this is the thing, it's like, oh, I look at that person's morning routine, and they get up, they do some breath work, and then they have a coffee, and then they go outside and do grounding, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. Like, yeah, walking barefoot in grass is nice. You don't have to justify that with some sort of Mother Earth weirdness. And it's like, okay, that person does that. Oh, well, this person, they also have an ice bath and they also go and exercise, so I'll do that as well. And it's like, oh, well, this person also does some journaling, so I'll do that as well. And before you know it, yeah, your morning routine is 2 hours long, and most of it's pointless. Like, if you enjoy walking barefoot while you drink your coffee, you should probably do that in the morning. That sounds like a nice morning. But you don't then have to add in all of this other shit that other people are doing for no reason at all.
Find what your weak link is and make that your morning routine. Like for me, I need to take action on my work straight away. For me, that is my stress reliever. But then because of the way that I've structured things, I have all of that shit in the first half of the day so that I can start training at 10 a.m. and then do my stress relief then, have the rest of the day to myself and studying and things that other people would probably do to start the day. Like figure out what works for you. Whereas I have people that need to have 5 minutes to themselves in the morning because the rest of the day they're chaotic. So figure out what works for you and don't try to make this like the best morning routine is not something that's going to take you forever. It's that minimum effective dose. What's the most you can get out of the least? That should leading on to the next thing I really, really want to freaking talk about because I just want to clip this out and make it like this big statement because it does my head in. The goal is to always get the most out of the least. And just because you don't give 100% does not mean you don't get anything out of it. But like people think that the more they do, the better. But if I can just do this extra thing, I'll get extra gains. But it's like you're living life. It's not meant to be friggin' like that is why people lose steam. That is why people struggle with motivation, struggle with discipline. It's not discipline that's the issue. It's the fact that your approach is something that's completely freaking stupid that you can't get the discipline to do the damn thing or you can't get the willpower. And of course, you're going to keep having freaking consistency issues if the plan is stupid to start with. Oh, I know what I should be doing, but I'm not doing it. Well, then what you think you should be doing isn't what you think you should be doing. Otherwise, you'd be doing it already. Break shit down, make things more simple, and be okay with starting at the smallest. Oh, but if I don't give 100%, what's the point? Let's apply it to that. And then let's apply it to working out because people like you can have shit training days. You'll have shit training weeks. Sometimes you might not be able to give it your best. Sometimes you might have an injury or you might be feeling sick and you have to go at 50% capacity. Oh, but should I be eating all of these calories if I'm not training as hard? Am I still going to get any muscle growth from this? Let's clear up the 100%. You don't get anything out of that working out, but then also factor that into lifestyle.
For once, it wasn't my dog. For once, it wasn't mine.
Whenever the garage door goes up, that one goes off.
Yeah. But so what you've just talked about there, I think is really important. When you were saying people want to give 100% or they feel like it's pointless, I don't believe you. Not you. I don't believe the person that says that. Like, if you come to me and you say, oh, I don't think there's any point in only training twice a week because if I train 4 times a week, that's better and twice a week's pointless. I don't believe you think that. I think you know that if you train twice a week, you'd be better off. What you're doing is you're creating a barrier so that you don't have to. So when I was at college, when I was like 18, we did a lesson on sports psychology with my tutor, Phil. Big shout out to Phil Miller. This stuck with me for like 15 years. He took us into the sports hall and there was a basketball hoop and there was like 3 hula hoops on the floor at different distances away. And it was like, if you shoot from that hoop, you get 5 points. That hoop, you get 2 points. That hoop, which is right next to the hoop itself, you get 1 point. And you have 3 balls and whoever gets the highest score wins or whatever. So we all did that. And the principle is the first hula hoop closest to the hoop, it was an easy shot. Anybody with reasonable eye-hand coordination can score at least 2 baskets out of 3 from right next to the hoop. The second hoop was like doable and you get more points for it. And the third hoop was bastard miles away. You were never going to hit that. Unless you do basketball all the time, you ain't never scoring from there. And afterwards, what he explained was that there are 2 kind of ways that people conceptually can look at motivation. You can look at a desire to succeed and you can look at a desire to avoid failure. And what you would think is that the people with a desire to succeed would shoot from the middle hoop because that gives you like the moderate chance of scoring for a good amount of points. And the people who are terrified of failure would shoot from the closest hoop so that they never miss. But that's not really true. People who are terrified of failure will also shoot from the furthest away hoop because they don't have the expectation of success. You can only fail at something if you thought you might succeed in the first place. If you never think you're going to succeed, if success isn't an option that's on the table, then failure isn't on the table either. And what I see when I look at people who tell me that without 100% effort, it's not worth it, is a person who knows they will never be able to give 100% effort, so they don't ever have to try. It's a way of saying I don't want to try without having to admit to yourself that you don't want to try. And so yeah, I just fundamentally do not believe people when they tell me that they think they need to give 100% or it's just not worth it. I think at that point, we need to talk a little bit more about why you don't want to give yourself the opportunity to fail and what's holding you back from that. Because if we can solve that, then all of a sudden you realize, oh, actually training twice a week is probably a good idea. You know what I mean?
It's almost that same mentality where if I don't do a full session, what's the freaking point? But it's just like I don't know if I actually think about this one, because I think it's something that will resonate with a lot of people. When I went into powerlifting, it was the idea of I want to stop focusing on being my leanest self. At least this way I can focus on getting stronger. But then it got to a point where everything was about numbers. And I spoke about this before, where I would message my coach and say, why am I so weak? I'm so pathetic. What's wrong with me? Why can't I get this lift up? Oh my God, I'm shit. I failed the lift that I was programmed. Like, it became all about chasing numbers to the point where I wasn't getting the same fulfillment out of it. And it took a while for me to detach. Like, it is very easy to attach yourself so much to numbers that you lose the real reason you're doing something, to the point where it's not actually exciting you anymore. Like, you're not doing it to actually just improve overall. It's becoming this numbers game, to the point where, okay, you're chasing numbers, but everything else is getting sacrificed in that. It's not just about the numbers themselves, but how you lift them. And just like losing weight, things aren't done linearly. And in saying what I was just saying, it's almost like you attach your worth to a certain outcome that you get versus the effort that goes in, without realizing that there are so many things that go into what impacts a training session. Like, for me now, I could have a really shit session in that, to me, is I do not feel my glutes enough this session. That sucks. Or I'm doing an exercise and it's just like, I only feel like I worked one side of my glute because the other glute didn't do its thing. Like, there are so many ways that you can get down on yourself for a session of going the way you expected, that you feel like, that shit, I'm in a shit mood now because my gym session was crap, blah, blah, blah. I didn't get anything out of work. Like, it's almost like we have this time perception, time warp thing. And this is a really great way to sum up a lot of what we're talking about, because this time warp is almost like you need to get everything done now, or this one session is going to make or break you. This one meal is going to make or break you. We need to optimize everything to the oblivion. It's just like, you're a freaking human. You're living your life. You have like things, like, you're meant to be living your life. Things that you put inside your life are meant to enhance it. There is no point living to freaking 100 whatever, and I just picked a random number, if it's going to be a shit quality life from year 70 onwards. So what's going to improve that? Building more muscle mass, getting stronger, and being healthy on the inside, so you're not on 100 pills in and out of the doctor's office. Do things that help that. What are you going to regret in your 80 plus? Not having good relationships, not having things that make you happy, not having people that look up to you because you made them and their world a better place. Like, there are all these little things that all come together to lead to, like, it's just like, if you focus on strength, the body is going to be the outcome of that. Actually, I had a little rant with Nick yesterday. I actually want this to be something that kind of sums it up. I really did want you to talk about why MPS isn't all you need to build muscle. So if you want, you can touch on that, touch on that. But I had this rant because there are so many people. With my girls, I get rid of the scale, but it's like, if you're not focusing on the scale, what are you focusing on? Pants, clothes. But if you're like this skinny fat person, or someone who's just lost a lot of weight, and then you bought tiny clothes for that end product, but now you're trying to build muscle and you're feeling your clothes tight. So now you're conflicted and you're not putting in the effort you need to put in to build the body you know you want, because, oh my God, my pants are tight. I need to fit in these pants for summer or whatever it is. That's sabotaging you from ever getting to that end goal. So I want you to talk about that to kind of sum this up, because I feel like that's a really important point.
Yeah, and that's a difficult issue to attack from one angle. So on the point you were saying about the short term thing, yeah, you're not going to be sat there in 2026 thinking, you know what, if I'd done better on my deadlift in April 2023, I'd be way stronger now. That's not how that's going to work at all. The purpose of each training session is to create an adaptation that will allow you to do something else in the next training session. And even that's probably thinking too short term. Each training month or each training block of 12 weeks leads into the following training block of 12 weeks. And as long as you do something over that 12 weeks that improves you in the next one, whether that is get stronger or build muscle, whether that is reduce body fat and not lose those things, or whether that's just improve technique, it means that you're going to be better off down the line. One of the things that I do with a lot of my athletes is we spend ages drilling in on basic shit. Strong feet in a back squat. Like strong feet in a back squat is so important. Without strong feet, your ankles collapse. Ankles collapse, knees collapse. Knees collapse, hips are no good. Hips are no good, you're going to miss the squat. We focus a lot on adequately drawing tension out of the bar in a deadlift. So there's loads of drills we do for that. And it feels like you're kind of wanking around for like 6 weeks, just not lifting heavier weights. But over time, week to week, your technique gets better and better and better and better. And then once you start loading up again, you're way stronger. Now, if you think short term and think every session, I need to build muscle. Every session, I need to be stronger. Every single session, I need to wake up the next day and I'm sore and I felt like I've put in a really good effort. The problem is that prevents you from doing the less taxing stuff that will make a bigger difference long term. And if you're getting down on yourself for bad sessions, you're always gonna struggle if you're getting yourself bad on bad sessions, because bad sessions are gonna happen. So one coach that I really look up to, so like there are a few people that I really look up to in this industry. One of them is Gab Fundaro that you spoke to on the last podcast. I think she's absolutely phenomenal. Another one is Coach Dan John from the US. I should remember where, but he teaches like football somewhere. Like he's a football coach, but the way he speaks about coaching and exercise, you can tell that he's been talking about exercise to teenagers for like 80 years. Like the man is an absolute wizard. But he talks about the rule of 5. And I forget what the actual quote is, so I just kind of adapted it. But basically what he talks about is across your training career, out of every 5 sessions, one of them is going to suck. One of them is going to be incredible. You feel like you could just put anything on the bar and you can lift it. 3 of them, you're going to kind of go in, you're going to punch your card, and you're going to go home and feel like nothing of any particular worth has been achieved, but you've hit your numbers. And as long as you can maintain that average for like 10 years, you'll get really strong. And that is the way I encourage my clients to think about training, because bad sessions will happen, sometimes for reasons you can predict. Didn't sleep very well last night, didn't eat very much yesterday. Sometimes it just happens and you just have a shit session and it's fine. You can use that shit session to work on other things. So, right, okay, I'm supposed to hit these numbers on deadlift today. I ain't got that in the tank today. But what I can do is I can focus on pulling the slack more. I can focus on controlling the negatives. I can whatever.
I love all of that. I really want to keep talking about this very thing, because people are scared to take that step back to really focus on the foundations that are going to lead to a stronger thing built on top.
And the problem is it hurts your ego. And I know it hurts your ego because, like, so something I've always struggled with back squatting. It's my favorite exercise, but I've always struggled. I'm not built to squat. My femurs are too long for my torso. I have to use a shitload of forward lean in a squat, and it's not that comfortable. Like deadlifting, something I've always picked up really easily. Like at my strongest a few years ago, before a bunch of stuff happened that prevented me from training for a while. At my strongest, I hit a 275 kilo deadlift, and my squat was in like the 190 range. Like that ratio was horrendous. And the reason was just because I needed to improve hip strength, ankle strength, timing, and bracing. And to work on those things, I couldn't lift heavy weights. I had to lift moderate weights. It had to be fairly easy squatting. And then I got my training stimulus from doing belt squats and leg press and all that. And you can do all that kind of stuff. And it feels like, I think, the two barriers that people have for stripping weight off is simply ego. If you have attached some degree of identity to the amount of weight that you can lift in the gym, being seen by other people in the gym to lift light weights hurts. And I experienced that. And I work with an incredible powerlifter at the moment who is recently retired from like international competition. And she really had a lot of issues with that. A lot of her identity was attached to, I am one of the strong people in the gym. People notice that I lift a lot of weight. I really like that. Now, if I'm going to go in the gym, talking about me now, like if people are used to me going in and I'll squat 60 for a couple of reps, 100 for a couple of reps, 140 for a couple of reps, and then start working in the 160 to 180 range. If I'm now going to be seen going to the gym and squatting 70 kilos, now I'm just like everybody else. There's nothing special here anymore. My identity's gone. But you have to take that hit. You have to.
This is why it's really important to listen to what I said before about life and what is it you're doing this for. And you and I are so freaking similar. It's insane. Like everything you just said, the squat, the deadlift. There was a point, like I find it really ridiculously funny that for me to warm up for squats now, I'm putting green plates on and then yellow plates, or just putting yellow plates on. Whereas before, literally the very first warm up I ever did for squats was putting on the blue plates. Squatting 60 was my warm up. And then I'd go to 70 and then 80. And then I'd start squatting from 90. And the same with the deadlift. I'd go from 60 straight to 100, straight to 120. And then I'd start from there. Whereas now it's just like 120. It's like my freaking working set, if I even get to 120. But if you're letting your identity be like, but if you compare me now to me when I was doing those weights, yeah, I was way more jacked back then. But my body composition is so much better now. My life is so much better now. My health is so much better now. Like you are not just the result of your training numbers. So much happens outside of just A to B of training. Like everything that you do has a particular component that leads you up to where you are now. And I want you to talk about that a little bit more as well, in terms of this is exactly where your habits come in. Before you try to optimize shit or even see a need for optimizing shit, what is it that is your weak link? What are the habits that you keep falling to that keep you, oh, I'm not disciplined enough? Like, what are the habits that you need to fortify to keep going? I want you to use this as a driving point to take home, because I think this is the important shit that makes the pants irrelevant. Because when you focus on this stuff and you have all your habits in the process aligned, your body is going to change. Your mindset is going to change because you are focusing on shit that grows you, things that pull you to the person you want to become, the life you want to live. You're going to be chasing strength, better function, things that just going to feel better, that the pants don't even become a part of the equation anymore because everything just feels better. So fuck the pants. Let's really ride this point home to tie this with the bow of wank3ry.
Absolutely right. So there's a few threads we need to tie off now. So the other reason that I think people don't want to strip weight off, other than the ego thing, is because they feel it's going to make them weaker. And I feel like the problem with that is it counterintuitively just leaves you in a weaker spot anyway. You are not going to get weaker by stripping weight off and improving your technique and then building it back up. You might end up lifting less weight, but that's not the same as being weaker. And so this is where we need to look at nailing the basics before seeking to optimize. To keep just running with the squat as a basic example, before you start looking at optimal loading parameters, before you start looking at wave periodization, before you look at all of that, how stable are you in the bottom position? Similarly, with nutrition, before you look at perfectly timing your intermittent fasting, before you look at delaying your coffee intake, before you look at making sure that you're eating only certain forms of carbohydrate, like, is your diet calorie adequate? Are you eating at regular times? Do you snack all the time, or are you eating balanced meals? How many fruits and vegetables are you eating? We sometimes need to step back and look at these basics, not because the basics are easy, not even because the basics are important to get right before you stack on more complex stuff, But because usually once you've got the basics nailed, that is all you need. Now, if you look at biohacking and a lot of the general wellness wankery, it kind of falls into three broad categories. Whenever you listen to a person who talks about like ways to optimize your health and ways to optimize your life, the first branch is just basic health recommendations. You listen to a lot of these people and they'll talk about get to bed on time, try to manage your stress quite well, eat primarily whole foods, develop strong, stable social connections, practice some amount of time improving yourself by regularly exercising, and read a book sometimes, like these kind of things. Very, very, very basic advice that you would get from anybody else. But the problem I have with biohackers is they use that as like a Trojan horse to sneak in a bunch of abject bollocks that they are going to then charge you for on this. And I think the reason is because they assume that you're probably not going to do that stuff. Most of us don't sleep well as we should. Most of us have diets that aren't as balanced as they could be. Most of us will miss training sessions. And to some degree or other, that will jive with some of you more than others. So my training, extremely consistent. My nutrition, pretty good. I'm currently transitioning to eating a vegan diet. And that transition I've found quite difficult. So I'm eating a lot more like high processed stuff at the minute than I would like to while I'm getting a handle on it. It's better than it was a month ago. When I was eating more animal-based foods, it was fully whole foods based, and I'm getting there anyway. But it's not perfect. It's pretty good. My sleep is a topic for another day. I work too often. I don't sleep as long as I should do. Now, because of that, I can sometimes feel like my energy isn't where it should be. And if I'm the type of person who places a lot of value on things like optimizing my health with these methods that make me more interesting, I can see how that can lead me to being tempted towards doing some of the other biohacky wellness wankery stuff. And the other two branches of wellness wankery are stuff that's based on mechanistic data. So you've got like the ice bath creates a massive boost of dopamine. When I talk about mechanistic stuff, something that I talk to my clients about all the time is that mechanisms are cheap. It's not difficult to look at something and say, this increases cortisol. This alters the expression of this gene. This affects your microbiome. And the question is, well, I don't give a shit about my dopamine. I don't give a shit about my microbiome. I give a shit about the effect that those things have on my health, well-being, and day-to-day life. So if I do something and it changes my microbiome, my question is, okay, but how does that influence my well-being? Like, does this change matter? Like, if I have an increased diversity in my microbiome, is that actually going to improve my cardiovascular health? Is that going to reduce my chances of developing sickness and diarrhea? Is this going to affect my risk of developing IBS symptoms? Or are we literally just talking that you found a study that increases microbiome diversity and I'm just going to take that as a benefit? Same as the dopamine thing. Ice baths radically improves dopamine. Right?
It's like people are just wanting to worry about things for the sake of worrying about things without realizing why the hell are you even wanting to know about that? Like, what is the point? Like, you're just, like, people don't want to focus on the shit that's actually keeping them stuck so they can focus on other things. And if I think about, I'm already talking about my gut enough as it is so people can kind of grab onto the fact I had a gut issue. But it's like, I want to know what's going on so I can take a freaking pill for it so I don't have to make the changes that I probably would need to make, but I still had to make the changes I needed to make. Otherwise, I would have kept feeding the issue that was going on in my gut. So I still had to do both. It's just like, to what extreme do I really want to do this thing? Because if I make it too extreme, then it's going to take away from my quality of life. But this is the same thing with anything else. Like, people are looking for the thing that's going to be less painful. But in the long run, if you're not going to sort the foundational habits, you're going to keep feeding that issue. If I kept eating the same things that I was eating, I don't want to talk about it on a podcast because people are going to go diagnosing themselves with bullshit. But if I kept eating the same things that I was eating, I would not have gotten rid of the issue because I would have kept feeding it regardless of how much I'm inoculating it. And this is what pisses me off about people trying to get friggin', here's another wellness wankery. people trying to get like Dutch tests and all this bloody other buffoonery. It's like, why do you want to get that? Like, are you going to get it to say, oh, I have these issues, or are you going to actually work actively to fix it? Because we already know you're stressed out. We already know you don't sleep well at night. We already know that half your diet is processed food. We already know that you're someone that isn't consistent with exercise. Why do you need a test to tell you what's wrong when we know the very things that we need to do to fix whatever could be wrong anyway?
100%. It's the same as when back. I don't see this conversation as much now, though this might just be the bubble that I'm in. But back in the day, it was really common for people to post a picture of themselves on a forum and be like, "Can you estimate my body fat percentage?" And it's like, well, why? Like, is the number that I give you going to influence the actions that you're going to take, or do you just want a number? So it's exactly the same. Like, you're going to send off a stool sample you're going to shit in a pot and send that in the post, and that's going to get analyzed, and that's going to come back to you. And now you're going to improve your diet in the way that you probably could have improved your diet if you just thought about the fact that you never eat vegetables. Now you're going to sleep better. Now you're going to reduce your alcohol intake. Like, what? Just make those. You don't need to do the test. And that's before we talk about. And I haven't listened to your full episodes with Dr. Fondara, but I would imagine she probably delved into this a bit. It's not that obvious that we can say right now what a healthy microbiome looks like. You can get two people who are of perfect health and their microbiome is completely different. There's no, like, it's not the case that, so if you look at blood sugar, there is a healthy range of blood sugar to be in. That's fairly well established. If your baseline blood sugar, if your fasting glucose is higher than whatever the healthy range is, I want to say it's like 110, but I could be wrong. I might have made that number up. But yeah, if your blood glucose is out of this range, that is bad. We can't do that with a microbiome. You can't send off a shit sample and they come back and go, oh, your lactobacillus is this, it should be this, therefore we need to do this to bring your lactobacillus up. We can't do that. The data do not exist to be able to do that. It is the case that if you've got like a significant dysbiosis, then that can be diagnosed and be like, right, that's a problem. But if you're like a relatively healthy person and you're just seeking to optimize, the knowledge does not exist within the scientific arena to actually make those prescriptive recommendations. We have to talk in very, very broad. People who do this have to talk in very, very broad terms.
I want to also touch on another thing when it comes to like recovery and stuff like that, because this is something that Luke mentioned as well with people like these things that people freaking live and die by. Like, stop using the numbers, stop checking your sleep data, stop checking your recovery data, and start listening to your friggin' self, because you can have a bloody amazing sleep, check this stupid thing, and it says, oh, you had a shit sleep, your training's gonna suck, and then you're gonna have a shitty session. Or you could have had a really shit sleep, and then this says that you slept fine, and it's just like, no, I didn't, bitch. But this is something like Luke says as well, Luke Lehman, my mentor. It's just like, okay, so this HRV is a really great HRV, but it might be shit for someone else. You need to track trends to figure out what is right or where you function at your best. Like my heart rate, for example, my resting heart rate is friggin' like, wait, let's see. It's 35 right now. Like that is my normal. If my resting heart rate was at 50, I could feel that difference. Like I feel the difference when my resting heart rate is at 50. I don't feel fit. I can't recover between sets at the gym. That is not optimal for me. Whereas someone that has a resting heart rate of 70, getting down to 50 would be a very damn good thing for them.
It's a really good example because my resting heart rate is at about 50. So like that is my normal. That's all. I think the lowest it's been when I was running regularly was like 47. Like it's never really dropped a great deal below 50. That's normal for me, and that feels good. If it creeps up towards like 60 odd, it's because I'm not sleeping enough and drinking too much caffeine. And I know that's a problem. I don't need my watch to tell me that I'm sleeping 5 hours a night and drinking twice as much caffeine as normal. So just to close off the Dutch test, and then I'll move on to the recovery thing.
Yes.
The other issue with stool samples is it biases the.
Oh, it's a sample. That's a urine sample.
Oh, sorry. What's the Dutch test for? I'm confusing it with something else. Was it test?
That's the stool test. The Dutch test is where they do dry urine and get hormones and all that kind of shit from it.
I've heard of that before. but the stool sample thing anyway. That biases the analysis towards like lower colon microbiome. It's not a full microbiome. If you wanted to take a full microbiome analysis, you would need to take samples from different areas of the colon, and you can't do that with a pot that you shit in. So it's questionable as to how useful that data is anyway. So don't do them. So on to the recovery thing, right? I'm currently on a bit of a tirade, and I've done some reels and posts and stuff about it. People need to worry so much less about recovery, man. They need to think about their recovery like fourth or fifth in line of priorities. And the reason I say that is because the purpose of training is to create a stimulus. That stimulus is then acted upon the body, given sufficient nutrients and time. Well, resources and time, we'll say. So the stimulus comes from the training, then that time and those resources, that can be considered like recovery stuff. And the problem that I tend to find when I look at people who come to me with existing programs is that they are not training hard enough. And that's the big one. Most people, and I don't mean this in like a you're not trying hard enough, because that's not the same thing. I believe you're trying really hard, but what you're trying really hard at isn't producing that training stimulus. You're not training with sufficient intensity, with a sufficiently regular schedule. So what I tend to find is that people who feel like they need to focus on recovery a lot train really often. And what happens is when you train really often, you develop fatigue. If fatigue from Monday's session leaches into Tuesday's session, leaches into Wednesday's session, and before you know it, you're training at 70%. Now you're trying really hard, but you're not training hard.
You're the solution intensity with more frequency and volume, which is not going to get the adaptations that you want out of the stimulus.
Absolutely not. And the solution to that is not to improve your recovery, it's to improve your training. So if you are training with a sufficient intensity to force an adaptation, which is going to be relevant to everybody, like if you've been training for 6 months, you don't have to train as hard as a person who's been training for 10 years. That's just how it is. But if you're training with a sufficient intensity, that will make you feel like you need to take days off. If you're training 7 days a week, unless it's incredibly well programmed, you're extremely fit, etc., etc. There are people who can do that, but general members of the population, if you're not squatting 300 kilos or running 5-minute miles, this is you for the most part, right? You don't need to be training 7 days a week. And if you are, you're training 7 days a week because you're able to, and you're able to because your training is of insufficient intensity to necessitate rest days. Now, when people are training hard enough to necessitate rest days, they will rest. During those rest days, you are now accounting for that time component. Now, when it comes to the resource component of recovery, the majority of this is going to be a calorie adequate diet, a protein adequate diet, and enough sleep. If you've kind of got those 3 things down, and then of course we can look at smaller things like the micronutrients, which you mentioned are extremely important for recovery. Stress management, extremely important for recovery. That falls into the time component. But yeah, if you're training hard enough, you're sleeping enough, and you're eating enough, even without those things, even without sleeping optimally, even with some day-to-day stress, and even without necessarily doing everything that would be optimal, you're still going to make progress. And if you add in special recovery supplements, if you add in special recovery protocols with massage guns and cupping and sports massage and stuff, it's questionable how much that's actually going to benefit you if you are not training hard enough in the first place. And I would argue, once again, most people don't train hard enough. If you want to test this, put yourself on a machine that you would regularly use, leg press, chest press, whatever, and put on a weight that you would usually use for like 8 to 10 reps with 1 or 2 reps in reserve, and do as many reps as you can. And most people will get at least like 15. It's as simple as that.
Not me. I fail on the very last. I fail on the very last.
You're not most people, though. Yeah.
I know. But that, like, this is the point. Like, you can't want someone's body or someone's results without looking into how they do things, their habits, the ways they do things. Because, like, when I train, my last rep is literally me failing technically. I don't muscularly fail. I technically fail. As soon as my technique starts to drop off, unless I'm on a machine, then I literally train to failure, then that is when I stop my set. That is why I only need those 4 sessions right now. And the funny thing is that I used to always need to get massage. For me, cupping's my thing. Cupping makes everything better. Like everyone has their own thing, but I find cupping the most relaxing thing in the world. Way better than massages. Massages don't relax me the same way, so I get a better recovery impact from cupping. It's like, it's a personal thing, whatever relaxes you more. But I don't find the need for any of that shit right now because I'm not training the same way I did when I was powerlifting. It's like if I'm recovering through sleeping enough, through eating adequately. If I was in a deficit, I would probably need to get those massages and some other things to help me recover. But right now, I'm providing enough. Like you said, I'm training hard enough. I'm recovering to match that. And I don't have that accumulated fatigue because I'm not trying to make up for my lack of intensity with more fitness wankery.
Yeah, and like as you say, if you're a competitive powerlifter, it's likely that you might benefit from a sports massage every now and then or whatever. But most people aren't that. Most people in the gym are there for health and well-being purposes, or to do like something that approximates bodybuilding but not bodybuilding. They just want to build some muscle so they look good in a t-shirt and shorts, which is fine. That is a grand goal. Good. However, that doesn't require the recovery protocols of an Olympic athlete. Like, you don't need to be going into cryotherapy. You're not going to benefit massively from utilizing all of these techniques, which are expensive and are sold to you as being the lack of this thing is what is holding you back from results. Usually the thing that is lacking from holding you back from results is an extra couple of reps every set. And if you can get that, you'll progress without spending additional money.
I guess this kind of feeds into that whole why MPS isn't all you need to build muscle. Like, you need to force change.
So muscle protein synthesis is it's half of muscle remodeling. So you've got muscle protein breakdown, where your body takes proteins that your body has, breaks them down for the amino acids so they can be used for other stuff, whether that is to put onto a protein elsewhere, or whether it's used for energy, or whether it's used to create carbohydrates, whatever. Your body breaks proteins down. And then muscle protein synthesis is where it takes amino acids from the blood, either because you've eaten something or because they've been broken from other proteins, and it puts them into muscle. So it's muscle protein breakdown is taking bricks off a wall. Muscle protein synthesis is putting bricks on a wall. Wonderful. Now, when you eat protein, that stimulates muscle protein synthesis. In between meals, muscle protein breakdown is elevated, primarily when amino acids leave the blood. The purpose of training to build muscle is to increase the ceiling of muscle protein breakdown and to increase the ceiling of muscle protein synthesis and to reduce the amount of muscle protein breakdown that you experience. That is the purpose of training. And so if you're training hard, what you're doing is you're making it the case that when you eat additional protein, your body has an increased ceiling of muscle protein synthesis. It can do more muscle protein synthesis. So the example I usually give is to give arbitrary units. During a normal day, you might break down 3 units of protein and build up 3 units of protein, and you maintain muscle. This is the experience of most adults throughout their adult life, unless they do something weird like have a very sedentary lifestyle. When you start training, all that happens is you're still breaking down 2.5 to 3 units of protein, but now you're building maybe 3.1 units of protein a day. And so you're just gradually increasing that ceiling of muscle protein synthesis. And provided you can continue to provide that stimulus to increase the ceiling, and then enough protein, which stimulates the process and provides the substrate for utilization, then you will eventually build muscle over time. People get way too hung up on doing stuff that like eliminates muscle protein breakdown. So people will try to like the slow release proteins, or you train in this way because this eliminates muscle protein breakdown. Don't pay attention to any of that. Just train hard.
Themselves in a deficit.
Yeah, just train hard. That creates this increased ceiling, and then eat adequate protein, and your body will kind of take care of the rest. To loop back into just wellness wankery in general, and I do think this is kind of an important part of the conversation. But the grounding assumption of a lot of what wellness wankery is built upon is that your body is fragile, that it's very easy to break, that problems happen all the time, and you need to have this almost. Are you familiar with the Red Queen problem?
No.
No. So the in the second Alice in Wonderland book, so Alice Through the Looking Glass, she has a meeting with the Red Queen on this giant chessboard, and they're running faster and faster and faster, and the world is moving away from them at the same pace. And she says something along the lines of, "That's the thing." Or that's the thing here. We have to run faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Red Queen problem. That's been used to describe loads of stuff like evolution of prey animals. So as prey animals get faster, the faster predators catch them. And that means that over time there's this arm race where prey animals and predator animals get faster and faster to keep up with each other. People seem to have this view of the body where, like, it's a Red Queen problem. You have to keep doing more and more and more and more shit to prevent your body just crumpling down into like a bin bag of garbage. But that's not how that works. We are the dominant species on the planet because we're extremely adaptable. We can thrive in radically varying conditions, and we can handle significant amounts of stress. Like, we are resilient. It used to be the case that resilience was a marker of fitness, and now every person that people look up to in the fitness space seems to talk continuously about all of the ways that they are broken. Like, oh, I've got this issue and that issue and that issue, and I have to, if I don't spend my 10 minutes doing breath work in the morning, then my stress through the day becomes unbearable. It's like, how unresilient are you as a person that without meditation you fucking break? Like, how non-resilient are you as a person if you're going to tell me that if you sleep under 7 hours then you're completely useless? Like, there are single mothers out there with 4 kids who are sleeping 5 hours a night for years. They can handle it. How weak are you? But it's just, yeah, it's this propagation of the idea that the average healthy person is weak and fragile and needs to do all of this stuff to stay on top of it. And it's ridiculous. It's not the case. You will be fine. Like, you can eat a sugary food and undersleep and be hungover, and you'll be okay. Just don't do it all the time.
I love that. The way that I want to end it with this, and I'll let you end it after that. But the thing is, it's not optimal if it doesn't allow you to handle it when life isn't optimal and life is chaotic. Optimal means you're able to do, like, you're able to keep doing the thing, you're able to keep going when life is tumultuous. Because if you're optimal means everything goes standstill when life is tumultuous, or if skipping this optimal thing makes everything break down, then it's not really optimal, because we are humans. We are not lab rats, and we're not robots. I'll let you end it now.
Absolutely. So a big underlying reason why I hate all of the wellness wankery, so the ice baths, the fasting, all of that, is not because those things aren't sometimes beneficial, because they sometimes are. The problem is, I find the underlying reason why a lot of people do it and why a lot of people defend it. And this is where it comes into like the ideological side. So I'll just cover this very quickly, but I think it's important. So an idea that's extremely popular in the US, and now because of social media in the English speaking world broadly, we've all heard the Rammstein song, "We All Live in America." They were right. We all live in America now because American culture is what culture is broadly. There are small differences, but we absorb American culture through social media, and before that, in traditional media like movies and whatnot. So American culture is grounded primarily in Protestantism, and a specific branch of Protestantism. And a big thing of Protestantism is the Protestant work ethic. It's individualism. It is everything you have is because of your work, and you don't deserve anything that you didn't work for. That's the underlying ideology that can describe a lot of how Americans think, and so how English-speaking people who interact with Americans think all of the time. It's a grounding, fundamental assumption within our political systems that underpins liberalism, etc. We don't need to go into that any further, other than to say a lot of us in the West have been indoctrinated to believe from a very young age that you get what you deserve. That's what we assume. And if you don't deserve something because you haven't worked for it, you shouldn't have it. And that is the way we think. Now, when it comes to health, therefore, it necessarily follows that if you have health, it is because you did virtuous things to earn that health. And if you want to demonstrate your virtue, you can do more virtuous things that promote health, because health is a good thing to have.
It's the Queen syndrome.
And so this is where, what was that? Sorry, I've not heard that. I don't know.
No, it's the Queen syndrome that you just said.
Oh,
you do virtuous things, do more virtuous things.
Yeah. Now, some people will say, no, that's not true. I just care about these health promoting things because it promotes health. And I think that was demonstrated to be completely false within the discourse that existed around the drug that came out recently, semaglutide, or liraglutide, various different araglutides, which are these GLP-1 agonists, whereby if a person with obesity utilizes a GLP-1 agonist, it reduces their appetite significantly and helps them lose weight. Now, if the reason that people believed that everyone should exercise and eat well was because they thought it should promote health, they would support this drug because it helps to facilitate that. But they don't. People have a massive opposition to the people who would benefit from it using this drug, because it feels as though they're therefore going to get weight loss that was unearned. And what this tells you is that in the minds of a lot of people, the earning of that weight loss and the earning of that health is more important than the health itself. It is the demonstration of virtue which gives you this result, which is the important thing, because it's important to be virtuous, not to be healthy. Does that make sense? Does that kind of follow?
Yeah, it does. And
cool.
It's almost, see, to me, when it comes to those drugs, though, it's more the fact that it's almost like birth control. People aren't aware of what it actually does, because it's like, don't take friggin' semaglutide if you don't know what the reason for taking it is, because all it's going to do is suppress your hunger. What happens when you get off it? You're going to gain all the weight back if you haven't learned how to have a lifestyle that supports that new level of you. But otherwise, all it's doing is helping you do those health promoting things if hunger is the issue at bay. It's like you need to know. Yeah.
Of course, and that's a completely valid concern. That is a completely valid part of the conversation. Is that right? If you're going to use these drugs, it should be alongside proper medical supervision and alongside nutrition and exercise counseling, so that you can then continue these healthy habits after the weight loss. That's a really important part of the conversation. But people had more of just a, no, you shouldn't use drugs. You should just eat well, exercise, and so on. And that, again, tells us that it's about the virtue. So here's the thing. Once you are in the mind space of you should do exercise and you should eat well because it's virtuous, you need to question why that is. And the reason that that's virtuous, just to go back to the Protestantism thing, is because you are denying yourself earthly pleasures. To exercise regularly is to deny yourself comfort. To eat well is to deny yourself enjoyable foods. And this is where a lot of the biohacking comes in, because this is kind of gendered in that a lot of like wellness discourse, think Goop, think Gwyneth Paltrow, a lot of that is denying yourself tasty foods because they're toxic. It's denying yourself processed foods because of this. And we're going to eat salads and organic foods, and we're going to meditate and do all of these things that are hard and that are restricting our access to these enjoyable things, because that is going to make us better. And then biohacking is just that, but for men. It's the same thing. It's the same thing, but instead of white and pastel colors, it's black and blue. But it's the same basic advice. We need to deny ourselves access to these earthly pleasures, because to do so is virtuous. And where biohacking comes in is it's just the Red Queen version of that. It's like, right, we already eat well. We already exercise regularly. How can we make ourselves suffer more in this vein? Well, we can get in an ice bath. We can intermittent fast. We can run 10 miles a day every morning for breakfast to show how disciplined we are, because the discipline itself is the virtue, not the benefit you get from it. And so what we always need to ask ourselves whenever we're faced with any of these things is there any evidence that this is going to benefit me? If there is evidence, is that evidence actually outcome based, or are we talking mechanisms? Don't tell me that it's going to increase my dopamine by 200%. Tell me it's going to decrease my risk of depression, or tell me it's going to increase my whatever. And then finally, are the people who are promoting this because it's a good idea that's going to improve my health? Or are they promoting it because they are relying on the assumption that it is hard and therefore it is good per se? Because usually that's what you're going to find.
People don't know how good they can feel until they feel good. So they inflict all this other crap on them without realizing that literally this whole conversation, tying it all up right now, is the fact that if you take a step back, drop your ego, drop your need for instant benefit, drop your need to get results yesterday, like this, I get the impatience. I really do, because I'm working really freaking hard right now and my butt isn't the size of a freaking Nicki Minaj peach right now, despite how freaking hard I'm working. And that's the same thing that you can put to anything, because muscle growth takes time. Results take time. Things take time, and it compounds over time. And trying to throw more at it isn't going to make it go any faster. Like, there's a rate of reaction. There's like a limiting rate. The limit actually does exist in this equation. We do not live in bloody Mean Girls land. Like, there is a limit. And this is the very thing. Like, if you know how good you can feel from doing those bare basics, stripping it back and working on the foundations, it's almost like, let's just chuck in the leg press, leg extensions, do some plyos, throw in all these things that we know make the biggest bang for the buck. But that, like, what is the purpose behind throwing in all the things that you think make the biggest bang for your buck? You're just going to keep hitting plateaus. You're going to lose any motivation long term, because there is no sense of purpose. There's no clarity. There's no direction. It's just throwing everything at it to see what sticks to get the biggest outcome right now, which isn't really going to happen. It's like, figure out your weakest link, build a really strong foundation, and have something that drives progress in a way that is going to add to your life. Hey, it's functional because now you're squatting better, you're moving better, you have something to chase to feel better, which is where I am finally at right now, in the fact that it's like, oh, I felt my glute. Everything's focused around glutes. I'm sorry, I'm allowed to do that. But it's, oh, I really felt my glutes on the hack squat. Oh, I really felt my glutes on the reverse lunge. Oh, I'm really feeling my hamstrings on this hamstring curl. Up the weight. I'm not feeling it right now. Drop the weight. This feels much better. It's like when you chase things for knowing this actually feels good. I'm not just chasing things for load. I'm not just chasing things and realizing, hey, I'm actually making compensations because it's not working the muscle. And it's doing things because, like Tom said, you're focusing on the benefits you get from it, not the discipline or the force or the number or the willpower or the, oh, I'm such ironclad. Like, zoom the fuck out.
Yeah. And like, you're not going to be lying on your deathbed thinking, God, I wish I was cold more. Like, it's just not going to happen. Like, even if there is a minor benefit to it, are you getting that benefit elsewhere? And does it just justify the effort? Or are you being sold this hyper disciplined, hyper virtuous image of someone that it's a waste of time? When you zoom out for 10 seconds, it's like, all right, cool, I could be more disciplined by making myself ice bath every day, but is that going to make me a better husband? Is that going to make me better in the gym? Is that going to improve my longevity? Because unless you see evidence of that specifically, the assumption I would always give is it's going to be no. And to your point about the exercise, that's where we just loop back to what we were saying earlier, where, yeah, if you're not feeling your glutes on a leg press, you could add in 85 different exercises, or you could do the hard work and just get better at leg pressing, rather than trying to avoid it and avoid the risk of failure by trying, by just adding something else that might work.
Yeah, I love that. And that's the perfect way to end this. It's, don't be afraid to take a step backwards in order to actually start progressing for real this time. So with that, Tom Bain, I'm going to put it down below so you guys know how to spell it, but Tom Bainbridge Coaching on Instagram. I'm probably going to end up spreading out clips from this over bloody 2 months worth, because there is so much gold in this. Like, you hear people being anti-biohackers. I think I'm going to be crowning, yes, I'm crowning myself. I'm crowning myself and Tom the anti-wank3ry people.
Yes, like it.
we kind of blitzed quite a lot there, and I really hope you benefited from it. And go follow Tom. Go friggin' just go through your following and see what people spit absolute bullshit and unfollow them. Because the more you are exposed to that shit, the more you're going to keep getting yourself complicated into a bloody noodle soup of just noodles.
The three questions I always advise you ask when looking at wellness stuff is, what is the evidence? So, like, are they providing a study? Or if someone says research suggests or studies show, that doesn't mean anything. You'll notice earlier in the podcast when I was talking about ice baths, I gave you a citation. I told you the study I was talking about. That's what honest people do. If I say studies show this, I could sit here and say, oh, studies show dogs have 5 legs. That's how easy that is to say. It means nothing. So what's the evidence? If it's studies show, that's the equivalent of nothing. If there's no evidence presented, Hitchens' razor, that which is provided without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Just ignore it. If there is evidence, okay, what is the evidence? Is this an irrelevant population? Are we looking at a rat study? If so, I don't give a shit. Right, okay, so we've got evidence and it's in humans, so what? Like, right, okay, it increases dopamine, so what? It increases metabolism, so what? Is this going to lead to improved body composition? Is it going to lead to improved health? And you don't have to go searching for those answers. What you have to look for is, are those 3 answers in the post itself? The person should present the study, they should tell you what the study was in, and they should tell you the outcome, and it should be an outcome, not a mechanism. And if those 3 things are missing, just unfollow that person. They're a waste of time.
I love that so much. I love that. So with that, thank you for coming on. I think I could just talk to you for ages because that was just so much fun. And I cannot wait to get this out. I hope you guys listen to this a couple of times, take some notes, message us, share it, and rate the podcast because there was so much fun and accents thrown around in here.
No, thanks very much for having me on, Ruby. It was really good. 2-hour podcast is always a good one. And thanks for listening, everyone. I hope there was something useful in there.